The temperature dropped 12 degrees overnight in October of 1953 when Robert Mitchell stood in his barn at 4:30 in the morning, watching his breath turn to fog in the lantern light. The radio from the house had been warning about an early winter system pushing down from Canada, and he knew what that meant. Every farmer in Greene County, Iowa knew winter was coming early, and the man who wasn't ready would pay for it with dead livestock, burst pipes, and hungry children come February. Robert's father had frozen to death in a barn during the blizzard of 1912, trying to save calves he hadn't properly sheltered. The old man had been caught unprepared, and Robert had found him the next morning, stiff as cordwood against the north wall, where the wind had driven snow through gaps in the boards. That image lived in Robert's mind every autumn, driving him through the exhaustive pre-winter preparations that separated successful farmers from bankrupt ones. He pulled on his heavy coat and grabbed his checklist, a piece of paper worn soft from being folded and unfolded every October for 15 years. His wife Sarah had written it out in 1938, copying the wisdom from her grandfather, who'd farmed through the brutal winters of the 1880s. The list contained 47 specific tasks, each one representing a potential disaster if ignored. Robert had added 3 more items himself, after nearly losing his herd in '49. The first check was always the chimneys. A clogged chimney meant carbon monoxide poisoning or a house fire, and both killed families every winter across the Midwest. Robert climbed onto the farmhouse roof as the sun started painting the eastern sky orange and red. His chimney brush, a weighted chain with stiff bristles, scraped against the brick as he worked it up and down. Black creosote chunks fell into the fireplace below, the accumulated residue from a year of burning corn cobs and oak logs. He could hear Sarah down there, sweeping the debris into a bucket. When he pulled the brush out, he inspected the mortar between the bricks. Freeze-thaw cycles destroyed mortar, and a crumbling chimney let rain and melting snow seep into walls, rotting the house from the inside out. He found 2 spots where the mortar had cracked, pulled out his trowel and cement mix, and patched them right there in the dawn cold. His fingers ached, but frozen fingers healed. Collapsed chimneys didn't. Next came the barn roof. Robert walked every square foot of it, looking for loose shingles or nail pops. He'd learned this lesson hard in '46, when a single loose shingle had let water pool under the roofing felt. By February, he'd had a hole the size of a wash tub, and snow had been falling directly onto his hay storage. Wet hay meant moldy hay, and moldy hay killed horses with respiratory infections. He'd lost his best draft mare that year, a 1,000-pound animal worth $300, because he'd missed 1 loose shingle in October. He found 7 loose shingles this year and hammered them down with roofing nails, then sealed the edges with tar. The tar was thick and sticky in the cold morning air, fighting him as he spread it. But it would save his hay come January, when the temperature hit 20 below zero, and the wind drove snow horizontally across the prairie. The gutters came next. Clogged gutters meant ice dams, and ice dams meant water backing up under shingles and into the house. Robert scooped out leaves, dead birds, and decomposing mice, throwing the mess down to the ground. Sarah's chickens rushed over to investigate, pecking at anything that might be edible. The downspouts had to be clear too, and he used a plumber's snake to push through a blockage in the south downspout where leaves had compacted into a solid plug. Inside the barn, Robert inspected every board on the north wall. Winter wind came from the northwest in Iowa, and gaps in that wall meant dead animals. He'd already replaced 6 boards earlier in the month, but now he checked the caulking between the boards and the foundation. Mice and rats chewed through caulking, creating drafts that seemed small, but could drop the barn temperature by 15 degrees when the wind howled at 40 miles per hour. He found 3 gaps and filled them with oakum and tar. The barn windows needed attention too. Broken glass meant frozen water troughs and frostbitten livestock. Robert had replaced 2 cracked panes in September, but now he checked the glazing compound that held the glass in place. Old compound cracked and fell out, and loose glass rattled in the wind until it broke. He found 4 windows that needed reglazing and spent 2 hours carefully removing old compound, cleaning the grooves, and applying fresh glazing with his putty knife. The livestock water system was critical. Robert's farm had a well with a hand pump, and in winter, that pump froze solid if he didn't protect it. He wrapped the pump mechanism with burlap bags stuffed with straw, then built a wooden box around the whole assembly. The box kept the worst wind off the pump, and the straw insulation meant he could still pump water when the temperature hit 0. He'd also learned to pump water every single day, no matter what. A pump that sat unused would freeze overnight, and thawing a frozen pump was a day-long job that often ended with broken pump parts. The livestock needed water twice a day in winter, and frozen troughs killed animals. Cattle and horses could survive cold if they had water. Without it, they died in 3 days. Robert had installed a wood stove in the barn specifically to heat water for the troughs when the temperature dropped below 0. Now he checked the stove, cleaning out the firebox, inspecting the chimney pipe for rust holes, and testing the door latch to make sure it sealed tight. A stove door that didn't seal meant inefficient heating and wasted wood. He stockpiled firewood next to the stove, splitting oak and hickory into small pieces that would burn hot. The wood had been cut and split in July, giving it 3 months to season. Green wood didn't burn hot enough, and wet wood created creosote that clogged the stovepipe. Robert checked each piece, setting aside anything that felt damp for the house fireplace, where it could dry out completely. The livestock shelter was next on the list. Robert's cattle had a 3-sided loafing shed on the south side of the barn, open to the south but closed on the north, west, and east sides. The roof kept snow off the cattle, and the walls blocked the wind. He'd built the shed in 1948 after losing 2 calves to hypothermia during a January blizzard. The calves had been born during the storm, and without shelter, they'd frozen within hours, despite their mothers trying to keep them warm. Now he checked every support beam in the shed, looking for rot or termite damage. A collapsed roof under heavy snow would crush his cattle. He found one beam with suspicious soft spots, tested it with his pocket knife and decided to replace it. He pulled a new cedar beam from his lumber pile, a beam he'd cut and stored 2 years ago specifically for repairs, and spent 3 hours removing the old beam and installing the new one. The work was hard and his shoulders ached, but a crushed cow was worth $200, and replacing one beam was cheaper than replacing livestock. The hay storage was critical to winter survival. Robert had put up 80 tons of hay during July and August, cutting alfalfa and timothy grass from his 40-acre hay meadow. The hay was stacked in the barn loft, compressed and dry. Now he checked the loft floor, looking for weak boards that might collapse under the hay weight. A floor collapse would dump tons of hay onto the livestock below, smothering them instantly. He found 2 boards that flexed more than they should and reinforced them with additional joists. He also checked the hay quality, pulling random bales and inspecting them for mold. Moldy hay meant respiratory problems for horses and cattle, and he'd learned to be ruthless about throwing out questionable bales. He found 3 bales with suspicious grey patches and threw them down to burn. $60 worth of hay was cheaper than a $500 horse with damaged lungs. The grain storage needed inspection too. Robert had 1,200 bushels of corn stored in his crib, enough to feed his livestock through winter and have seed corn for spring planting. Mice and rats destroyed grain, and moisture ruined it. He walked through the crib, checking for holes where rodents might enter, and found 2 gaps where boards had warped. He nailed tin sheeting over the gaps, creating a barrier that rats couldn't chew through. He also checked the corn moisture content by squeezing kernels between his fingers. Corn stored above 14% moisture would mold and rot. This corn felt right, dry and hard, but he checked it anyway, because assumptions killed livestock. Moldy corn contained toxins that caused liver failure in cattle, and he'd seen a neighbor lose 6 cows in 47 from feeding moldy grain. The chicken coop required winterization too. Chickens survived cold weather if they stayed dry and out of drafts, but they stopped laying eggs when stressed. Robert needed eggs through winter for his family and to sell in town for cash income. He checked the coop for drafts, finding 3 gaps where wind could enter. He stuffed the gaps with straw and nailed boards over them, leaving ventilation holes near the roof to prevent moisture buildup. Chicken waterers froze solid in winter, and thirsty chickens stopped laying eggs. Robert had developed a system where he brought hot water from the house twice a day, pouring it into the waterers to keep them thawed. Now he checked his water buckets, looking for cracks or rust holes. A leaking bucket meant wasted trips to the well in sub-zero temperatures. The tractor needed winterization. even though he wouldn't use it much until spring. His John Deere Model B sat in the machine shed, and Robert knew that mice nested in tractors during winter, chewing through wiring and destroying rubber fuel lines. He started the tractor, let it run for 20 minutes to circulate oil through the engine, then drained the radiator completely. Water left in the radiator would freeze and crack the engine block, destroying a $1,500 tractor. He filled the radiator with kerosene instead, a trick his neighbor had taught him. Kerosene didn't freeze and it prevented rust from forming inside the radiator. Come spring, he'd drain the kerosene and refill with water. He also disconnected the battery and carried it to the basement where it wouldn't freeze. Frozen batteries cracked and died, and new batteries cost $30. The farm truck needed similar attention. His 1946 Chevrolet half-ton was essential for hauling grain and supplies, and it had to work all winter. Robert changed the oil, switched to lighter weight winter oil that would flow in cold weather. Summer oil turned thick as molasses below zero, making the engine almost impossible to start. He also checked the antifreeze in the radiator with a hydrometer, testing whether it would protect to 40 below zero. It tested good, but he added a quart anyway, because frozen radiators cost $200 to repair. The windshield wipers needed inspection too. Brittle wiper blades smeared snow instead of clearing it, and driving blind in a blizzard killed people every winter. He replaced both blades, then tested them on a wet windshield to make sure they cleared properly. He also checked the heater, making sure warm air blew through all the vents. A working heater meant he could make emergency trips to town during blizzards without freezing to death. Fences required attention before snow covered everything. Robert walked his entire fence line, 8 miles of posts and wire surrounding his 320 acres. Broken fences meant escaped livestock, and cattle that wandered onto highways caused accidents that killed people. He found 12 fence posts that had rotted at the ground line, pushed over easily when he leaned on them. He dug out the rotten posts, set new cedar posts, and tamped them solid. Each post took 30 minutes to replace, and his back screamed in protest. But loose cattle in winter died from exposure or got hit by cars. The barbed wire needed checking too. Broken wire with sharp ends injured cattle, cutting them and causing infections that killed them slowly. Robert walked the fence line with wire cutters and pliers, splicing broken wires and tightening loose ones. He found 3 wires that had snapped, probably from deer jumping the fence, and repaired them with wire sleeves that held stronger than the original wire. The windbreak trees needed inspection. Robert had planted 300 pine trees in 1942, creating a windbreak on the north and west sides of his farmstead. The trees blocked the worst winter wind, reducing heating costs and protecting livestock. Now he checked the trees for disease or damage, looking for dead trees that might blow down onto buildings during winter storms. He found 2 dead pines and marked them for cutting, planning to drop them safely away from the barn. The garden needed preparation too. Sarah's vegetable garden had provided food all summer, and now they had to protect it for spring. Robert helped her pile manure and straw on the garden, creating a protective layer that would compost over winter and enrich the soil. They also pulled up the stakes and trellises, storing them in the shed to prevent winter wind from breaking them. The root cellar was critical for food storage. Robert and Sarah had stored 200 quarts of canned vegetables, 50 bushels of potatoes, 30 bushels of apples and 20 bushels of carrots in the underground cellar. The cellar stayed cool but above freezing if properly insulated. Robert checked the cellar door, making sure it sealed tight. Cold air sinking into the cellar would freeze the stored food, ruining their winter food supply. He also checked the cellar ventilation pipe, making sure it wasn't clogged. Proper ventilation prevented moisture buildup that rotted potatoes and apples. He found the pipe clear, but added a screen over the top to prevent mice from entering. Mice in the root cellar meant gnawed vegetables and contaminated food storage. The fuel supply needed calculation. Robert burned coal to heat the house and wood to heat the barn. He'd ordered 6 tons of coal in September, delivered from the rail yard in town and dumped in his coal shed. Now he checked the pile, making sure he actually had 6 tons. Short deliveries happened, and running out of coal in February meant a freezing house. The pile looked right, and he measured it to be sure. 6 tons would last through winter if they burned carefully. The firewood pile was massive. 20 cords of oak and hickory stacked under a lean-to to keep it dry. A cord was 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long, and Robert had spent July and August cutting and splitting wood. 20 cords seemed like a mountain of wood, but the barn stove burned a cord every 2 weeks when the temperature stayed below zero. He checked the stack, making sure it was stable and wouldn't collapse onto someone. The machinery shed needed organizing. Robert's plow, disc, cultivator, and mower sat in the shed, and he needed to reach them in spring without digging through snow. He arranged everything logically, putting spring equipment near the door and storing summer equipment in back. He also oiled all the metal parts to prevent rust, coating plow blades and disc blades with thick grease. The medicine supplies needed checking too. Robert kept veterinary supplies in the barn office, and winter meant treating sick animals. He inventoried his supplies, checking dates and quantities. He had penicillin for treating infections, iodine for disinfecting wounds, mineral oil for treating bloat, and electrolyte powder for treating dehydration. He also had obstetric chains for pulling calves during difficult births, essential equipment when cows calved in January. He made a list of needed supplies and gave it to Sarah. She would order from the veterinary supply catalogue, making sure everything arrived before snow closed the roads. Rural mail delivery stopped during blizzards, and being caught without medicine meant watching animals die from treatable conditions. The emergency supplies needed attention too. Robert kept a disaster box in the barn containing matches, candles, rope, a hatchet, a first aid kit, and 3 wool blankets. If he got trapped in the barn during a blizzard, these supplies could save his life. He checked the matches, making sure they were dry and stored in a waterproof tin. He tested the candles, making sure they lit. He inspected the rope for fraying and replaced one section that looked weak. The telephone line was critical for winter safety. Robert's farm had a party line telephone shared with 6 other families, and that phone was their emergency connection during blizzards. He walked the phone line from the house to the road, checking for sagging wires or broken insulators. He found one insulator that had cracked, probably from a bird landing on it, and replaced it with a spare he kept in the barn. He also checked the phone inside, making sure the connections were solid and the line had a clear dial tone. A dead phone in winter meant isolation during emergencies, and he'd heard stories of families freezing to death because they couldn't call for help during blizzards. The road to town needed consideration too. Robert's farm sat 3 miles from the main highway on a gravel road that drifted shut during blizzards. The county snowplow eventually cleared it, but sometimes that took 3 days. Robert kept emergency supplies in the truck for trips to town, including a shovel, chains, a tow rope, blankets, matches, and food. He checked these supplies now, making sure everything was ready. He also filled 5-gallon gas cans, storing them in the shed. If he ran out of gas during a blizzard, walking 3 miles to town meant risking death from exposure. Extra gas meant safety. The family emergency supplies needed checking too. Sarah had prepared a disaster box in the house containing canned food, bottled water, candles, matches, a battery radio, and extra batteries. If a blizzard knocked out power and closed roads for a week, these supplies would keep the family alive. Robert checked the food dates, rotating out old cans and replacing them with fresh ones. The battery radio was critical for weather information. Robert installed fresh batteries and tested it, tuning to WHO radio in Des Moines. The signal came through clear, and he made a note to check it weekly through winter. By late afternoon on the 3rd day of preparations, Robert stood in his yard reviewing his checklist. Every item had a check mark. The farm was ready. He'd spent 3 12-hour days on preparation, but every minute mattered. He thought about his neighbors, the ones who put off winterizing until November, when the first blizzard caught them unprepared. Those men would spend winter fighting disasters that could have been prevented with October preparation. The radio crackled from the house, announcing the temperature would drop to 18 degrees tonight with possible snow flurries. Robert smiled. Let it snow. His chimneys were clean. His barn was tight. His animals were sheltered. His fuel was stocked and his equipment was ready. Winter could come now. He was prepared. Sarah called him for dinner and he walked toward the house, his muscles aching from 3 days of hard work. Through the kitchen window, he could see his children doing homework at the table. warm and safe. In the barn, his cattle stood in their shelter, protected from the wind. In the loft above them, 80 tons of hay waited to feed them through the cold months. In the coal shed, 6 tons of fuel waited to heat the house. In the root cellar, preserved food waited to feed his family. This was the wisdom the old farmers had passed down through generations. Winter preparation wasn't glamorous work. It was tedious, exhausting, and endless. But it was the difference between survival and disaster. The farmers who treated October preparation as optional learned hard lessons come February, when their livestock froze, their pipes burst, their chimneys caught fire, and their families went hungry. Robert had learned these lessons from men who'd farmed through the brutal winters of the late 1800s, men who'd survived blizzards that killed their neighbors. Those men taught that preparation was everything, that lazy October meant desperate February, and that the farm protected those who protected it. As he sat down to dinner with his family, warm and full, Robert knew he'd done right by the old wisdom. The checklist his wife had written 15 years ago represented decades of accumulated knowledge, hard lessons learned by farmers who'd paid for their mistakes with dead livestock and frozen fingers. Following that checklist wasn't optional, it was survival. The temperature dropped that night, just like the radio predicted, and frost covered the fields by morning. Winter was arriving early in Greene County, Iowa, but Robert Mitchell was ready. His farm would survive because he'd honored the pre-winter preparations that old farmers had perfected through generations of cold weather farming. The work was done, the farm was protected, and his family would make it through to spring. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed learning about the pre-winter preparations that kept old American farms running through harsh winters, please subscribe to our channel for more stories about farming wisdom and rural heritage. Hit that like button and share this video with anyone interested in agricultural history and traditional farming practices. These stories preserve important knowledge from America's farming past. This video is inspired by real events and historical farming practices from the 1930s through 1970s. It is not intended to represent or offend any specific individual or family. Robert Mitchell is a representative character who reflects the real experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations and performed these essential pre-winter preparations during this era. The farming techniques, equipment, weather challenges, and community dynamics portrayed here are based on documented agricultural practices and oral histories from rural American communities during this period.